All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today and being part of the SECAS LGBTQ plus youth inclusive sex ed webinar series. These series are taking place all week long. We have a webinar every day at 2 o'clock. So find out more, we'll chat the link for you to find out more information about each topic each day. We have an amazing lineup of panelists today that I'm really looking forward to hearing from. Yesterday, we focused a lot on queer liberation and joy. And today we'll really look at what inclusive sex education is and what that means. These webinars will be recorded. All of the webinars will be made available on the SECAS website. We will put up all of the SECAS, or the recordings, all of the recordings for the webinars will be on the website, as well as any reference to materials, any action items that come out of these webinars. We'll also host them up there as well. A friendly reminder, you will not be able to speak, or we won't be able to hear you on this webinar if you are an attendee, and your camera won't work, so we won't be able to see you. So no worries if you don't see yourself on the platform. The camera feature is only available for panelists. We will have a question and answer section at the end of this webinar. We'll ask that you put all of your questions in the Q&A portion of the Zoom feature, and we'll be able to answer your questions that way. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful moderator for today, Becca, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I am Becca Mui. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the education manager at GLSEN. I'm going to talk a little bit about GLSEN, about our organization, and then turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. So GLSEN is a nonprofit organization that advocates for LGBTQ visibility and supports in schools. We do that through original research, educational programming, and our student leadership and action. We've got some of our panelists here from our National Student Council and Student Advocacy. We also have a policy department that's based in DC and 45 really incredible local chapters. GLSEN uses an intersectional approach to LGBTQ advocacy, which is a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. We understand the importance of centering students with multiple marginalized and system-impacted identities. We acknowledge the whitewashing of LGBTQ history and advocacy, and we know that LGBTQ youth of color and LGBTQ youth with disabilities are often the furthest from opportunity due to systemic oppression. So because of this, it's important that we center youth with multiple marginalized identities in our advocacy for them. This is our agenda for today. As I mentioned, we'll be meeting the panelists, letting them introduce themselves. I'm going to go through a little bit of our research and recommendations before we turn over to our panel discussion, where we'll address racial equity and experiences, their advocacy efforts, best practices, and then turn it over to your Q&A. Go for it, y'all.
So hi, my name is Sabin Morgan Cooper. I use they, them pronouns, based in San Diego, currently 19. A lot of the work that I do currently is through San Diego Pride, Gender Fluid Collective, and GLSEN San Diego. I'm just here to help provide more information, give my positive and both negative experiences being in the community and with growing up with sex ed.
Hi, my name is Sarah Emily Baum, she, they. I'm a staff writer with Sex Etc. magazine, which is a youth sex education magazine, which employs teen writers, but also works with sex educators and professionals. My pronouns are, oh, I already said my pronouns. And I'm here because I want to help empower people, specifically queer people, to make informed decisions about their bodies and lives.
Hi, I'm E or L Smith. I use they, them pronouns. I am GLSEN's 2019 Student Advocate of the Year. I'm from Round Rock, Texas, which is just outside of Austin. I am also the founder and president of the Central Texas GSA Coalition, which is a nonprofit that brings together students and LGBTQ plus related nonprofits across the Austin area. And I've done a lot of advocacy for inclusive sex ed through that. I'm also the founder of the Queering Education Project, which among other topics focuses a lot on ensuring that queer students access to information ed. And yeah, I'm here because I believe everyone deserves to have access to comprehensive and medically accurate information about sex and relationships and sexuality and consent. So I'm here today.
Hi, sorry. I'm Ika Tawa. I'm from Hillsborough, New Jersey. My pronouns are either they or she. And I work for Sex Etc. magazine, the same magazine as Sarah that she mentioned earlier. And I'm here today because I also believe everyone deserves the right to comprehensive sex education, regardless of their background or sexual orientation or gender identity. And schools should start implementing more comprehensive sex ed that teaches everybody more topics. So yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is El Martinez. I use they, them pronouns, and I am located just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. I'm 18 years old. I just graduated from high school, and I represent as a member of the GLSEN National Student Council. I have been for 2 years. And I'm here because I'm really passionate about sex education and giving youth, specifically queer youth of color, information to make informed decisions and feel fulfilled in their lives, and feel safe in asking those questions. I've worked with my high school on updating sex ed curriculums, and a large part of the work I do now is harm reductive practices in regards to safer use and safer sex.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to get to your questions and to hear your answers. And right now I'm just going to go through some research and recommendations before we turn it over. GLSEN's National School Climate Survey looks at the school experiences of middle and high school aged LGBTQ youth. We found in this study that nearly 9 in 10 LGBTQ students experience harassment or assault at school, and that overall trans students were more likely than other students to have negative experiences. GLSEN's latest research highlights the experiences of LGBTQ youth of color, focusing on the school experiences of Asian American and Pacific Islander, Black, Latinx, and Native and Indigenous middle and high school students. Our reports found that 2 in 5 LGBTQ students of color experience racist and homophobic victimization, and that experiencing both forms of victimization was associated with the greatest levels of depression, the lowest levels of school belonging, and also skipping the most days of school due to feeling unsafe. In terms of sexual health, LGBTQ youth face similar or greater risks for many adverse sexual health outcomes, including HIV, STIs, pregnancy, and intimate partner violence. The reality is that most students are not being taught inclusive and accurate information about LGBTQ people. That includes history, other topics in school, identity, and sex education. Our National School Climate Survey found that less than 7% of LGBTQ students received inclusive sex education. And in the absence of comprehensive LGBTQ inclusive sexuality education being taught in schools, queer youth often have to teach themselves and seek their own information online. GLSEN research found that LGBTQ youth were more likely to search online about sexuality, health and medicine, and HIV and STIs, which you can see in the chart there, and then their non-LGBTQ peers. And while this shows that LGBTQ students are seeking this information out, we don't know the inclusivity, the accuracy, or how developmentally appropriate the information that they're finding is. And that's why it's so important for sexual health curriculum to address LGBTQ identities and relationships so that all students can have access to accurate and appropriate information in school. I also have to highlight elementary. As an intentionally K-12 organization, we understand the importance of beginning these conversations about LGBTQ people and families in elementary school. I was an elementary school teacher before coming to GLSEN, and I know firsthand how important it is to begin these inclusive practices with young students. GLSEN's research, Playgrounds and Prejudice, found that almost 1 in 10 students did not conform to like quote unquote traditional gender norms. And then of these students, they were more likely to be called names, have negative outcomes like being, have mean rumors or lies spread about them. They were less likely to report feeling safe and more likely to have skipped schools for safety reasons. So this really models what we're seeing around gender nonconforming students in middle and high school, and we can see with this report that actually is beginning earlier. The foundation for inclusive sex and health education, including healthy decisions like washing your hands and building healthy interactions through friendships, really needs to begin in elementary school. Discussions about bodily autonomy, consent, and respecting boundaries should begin in younger grades before puberty education begins. So we wanted to highlight a couple of lessons that we have on identity and on gender, and our gender visual that we made in partnership with Interact, an intersex youth serving organization, in order to talk about some common gender terms. GLSEN recommends these practices for sex educators and really any adults who are working with youth. And we say youth, whether the young people have like come out or shared identities, these are really helpful practices to have. Just acknowledging a sexual identity and clearly distinguishing between sexual and romantic attraction. Providing healthy relationship examples that has a variety of sexual orientations and fluidity among them. And just asking open-ended questions when you're talking with youth. Making sure that you're not assuming or presuming assumptions about their identity, their level of sexual desire, relationship type, or sexual orientation. And finally, even though we know that trans students face higher rates of victimization and health risks than other LGBTQ students, most states don't have LGBTQ, like quote unquote, policies. They only address sexual orientation, and that can be true of some curriculums as well. So it's really important that comprehensive and anything we're saying is LGBTQ inclusive in terms of sex ed curriculum or advocacy. Really has to have gender identity and expression in a way that names trans and non-binary identities. And again, that this work really needs to begin before puberty education. Thank you. So now we will turn it over to our panelists. Just turn myself back on. All right. So why does LGBTQ inclusive sex education need to have a racial justice lens?
I think when we have these conversations about inclusive sex education, the overarching thing that we're all trying to achieve is just an inclusive approach to health. And you can't have that without a discussion about racial justice. So medical racism is discrimination against folks of color within the medical field. So for instance, Black women and femmes are likely to be ignored by their doctors when they tell them that they think they have an issue going on, or if they need testing for a specific thing. They're much more likely to be ignored by doctors, and that definitely needs to be a part of the conversation around sex ed and sexual health care. So that would be one, I guess, aspect of a racial justice lens. But additionally, in my research on LGBTQ inclusive sex ed, a lot of times folks of color are talked about as a risk factor for teen pregnancy and HIV transmission and other things. And thinking of your race or a part of your identity as something that is a risk to you, and instead of talking about the systems that cause that to be a risk, can be really kind of demoralizing and difficult to deal with. So it's definitely important that we take a culturally competent approach to sex ed and ensure that folks of color are not being marginalized in our classrooms when we talk about comprehensive sexuality education.
So in my past of like learning about sex ed and everything, I've realized, similar to what you said, that people of color, more specifically Black women, they're seen as a risk factor instead of talking about the systems, because systemic racism is a thing that affects so many people nowadays, and it has been affecting people forever. So instead of talking about it as they're a risk, talk about the systems in place that make it that way, and it'll just be more comprehensive and inclusive. And racial justice lens really does need to be included in everything, because there are aspects of racism and systemic racism that are found in a lot of things, and it shouldn't be just ignored when it comes to sex ed, because it's so important. And medical racism is so important, and many people should be aware that doctors and some nurses and medics, might not be taken seriously, so they need to be known of what they can do so they can be taken seriously, because there's a lot of information out there that's like, for example, if a Black woman goes to the doctor and she's denied treatment, tell them to write down their denial of treatment, because that makes them take accountability for their actions. And it's just so important that everybody is aware of what is going on and how they can be a part of the change and help it.
I think a lot of what I had to say in response to this topic has already been said, but I do want to just emphasize that I think it's often overlooked that a lot of what we know about anatomy, especially gynecology, came as the result of the suffering of Black women. And therefore, we have an obligation to not only understand how that system was created, but dismantle that system so Black women can get the support and the treatment that they need.
Obviously, I come to this conversation as a white ally, but I also come not just as someone who worked with Sex, Etc. magazine, but I'm also just a journalist in other capacities, and I heavily cover social justice issues, including queer issues, and a lot of times racial justice issues. And what I've learned through that is that everything has to do with racism. Everything in our society today is tinted by racism. One of my favorite Black journalists once said when I went to see her speak that like one of the greatest faux pas that white journalists or white professionals in any field make is assuming that their perspective is the objective truth, and that it doesn't mean that facts don't exist. They do exist, but it means a lot of the things that we consider or sometimes call a fact are filtered through the lens of mostly white journalists or mostly white doctors or mostly white historians. So it's really important to remember that whiteness is not the equivalent of objectivity, especially in terms of things like sexual orientation and gender. There were a lot of cultures prior to colonization that had much more liberal and fluid and progressive ideas about gender fluidity and sexuality, and those should be honored and respected.
And then on my part, just another emphasis of what everyone has said so far, but there needs to be a racial lens when you're talking about sex ed, just purely because of maybe the content that students are digesting. It's not always directed towards people of color or Black people in general. And then even then, without proper education or proper learning, Black people or people of color are lacking resources, they're lacking the education, and could it potentially perpetuate racial stereotypes about sex that have been littered across our history. So.
Thank you both so much for framing this conversation with that, and also just the ideas that you brought up around the systems and medical racism, and the way that that's important to have that as a lens when we're looking at transphobia and homophobia in these ways as well. We are going to turn it now to look more at your experiences. So if you would tell us what's your experience been with sex education, what's been left out, and what's been supported.
For me, I would say I had a fairly negative experience, and I wish I didn't. A lot of the sex education that I had was through my own learning and conversations with my parents, but fairly lackluster. I think I was 10th grade or so for biology, and we had a substitute teacher that blatantly told us that we could not figure out our sexuality or gender if we had not had our own sexual experience, and then telling us subtly that abstinence was the way until marriage. And so that was a whole situation and issue, also being part of the GSA at the time. But having that fixed later on and having to go through, you know, making sure these substitute teachers and teachers in general aren't giving their bias in their sex ed.
I was really lucky to have a pretty decent experience with sex ed in that I live in a pretty sex positive household. So my parents taught me a lot. We had a little like sex ed book club that was cute. And then I also did a program called Our Whole Lives through my church that was really comprehensive and great. We talked about gender identity, we talked about queer issues, we talked about protection, and that was awesome. But when I've only had one sex ed class in public school. It was 6 weeks long. I'm in the Round Rock Independent School District in Texas. So I had 6 weeks of sex ed in 8th grade. And I remember we learned that pregnancy lasts for 9 months, and you know, abstinence until marriage. Texas is definitely an abstinence only state, and it was very unhelpful. We looked at pictures of the physical symptoms of STIs, but there was no mention of prevention or treatment or anything else. So it was definitely like, it was a very shaming curriculum. Our teacher had to follow a script, so not the most ideal. So definitely got better education from my community than I did from my school.
Thank you.
I did not have a comprehensive sex education. I would say it was really like a week or two long of sex ed when I was in 8th grade, so when I was in middle school. And it was very shamey. Like they did focus on abstinence. They tried not to because New Jersey isn't an abstinence only state, but it was very shamey, and there were a lot of things like don't have sex until you're married, or all of this will happen to you. And it focused on a lot of the negatives of sex education in general. And then another thing I was missing was we had one day of a like sexual orientation thing where we had a bingo, and they just gave us definitions and we had to fill it out, and it was just like pretty much like the LGBT, and they didn't include anything after that. So it was like a lot of people who weren't previously aware, they just didn't learn anything really. And then I learned most of my sexual education from Sex Etc. magazine. So pretty much all of my information came from when I reached out and started working at the magazine. And I feel like that needs to change. And not every kid has a Sex Etc. magazine that they can work at. So it needs to be taught in schools because it's very important for people to know and understand this information.
Yeah, I think I got it pretty good. I'm in Massachusetts, so not abstinence only sex ed, generally medically accurate. When I was taking my sex ed course, my school we used to take sex ed in junior year, and they moved it to sophomore year because they were catching people late. It was very important distinction to make. I think I was really frustrated because I knew pretty much everything that I was supposed to like learn in that class going in because I had done my own research, and I had GSA president for a while, so it was the information I wanted to pass on to the youth that I was supposed to be mentoring. In regards to discussion of PrEP, there was no discussion of PrEP in my class, and that's something I argued a lot with when I sat down with teachers to kind of overturn the curriculum. And what really made me angry as well is that there was no discussion of PrEP, but there was also no discussion of PEP, which is disturbing to me, because I think that I was really hoping that folks would get that information, get that resource. I know that there were a few moments in my class where my teacher discussed PrEP and did not know what the acronym stood for, and that was very disappointing. Oh, absolutely pushback. I think that it's education that I had to pass on to the LGBTQ youth I could access within my school. It's not something I had any expectation of the school passing on just by just how I knew. And I also had a lot of pushback, and I ended up giving a lot of resources physically in terms of non-internal condoms and making sure that they were covering all different types of protection and barriers. So I think my experience with sex ed was just a lot of back and forth of me throwing resources at them and hoping that they would take that and incorporate it. But I think a lot of the education I've done has really been one-on-one between youth and myself, because that's what I found has been most beneficial, sadly.
Thank you.
So my experience with sex education, like the others, my school didn't really provide for me. I mostly found out through the trainings I had to do in order to start writing for Sex Etc. magazine, and just my own research on the internet, trying to vet good sources, which is hard. It's in the age of the internet, it can be really hard. You know, the only time they mentioned any queer identities is we watched a movie about the AIDS crisis, and they mentioned that in America, you know, it was just a big thing for the gay community, and that's really as extensive as it was. You know, one time I asked a question specifically about abortion, and I was told in my school district we're actually not allowed to talk about abortion at all in sex ed. And I think all of this is just really symptomatic of the issue that there's like inconsistencies across classrooms and across states, poor enforcement mechanisms. It's also, of course, really heteronormative. Not only did they not talk about safe sex for someone like me, but they actively perpetuated harmful stereotypes about assault and domestic violence, and insinuated that it can only happen between a boy and a girl, and that it's always the boy who's the aggressor, and it's always the girl who is the victim, and it's always going to look exactly like this. At the same time, it's weird because my home state of New Jersey is seen as like the gold standard of sex ed because it's required, it's factually accurate, and it, oh, I don't know. Sorry, I wrote something else down and I can't really read it. But yeah, it's not abstinence. It's not abstinence only. And so that's just to give you an idea of how low the bar is, like just the fact that we have medically accurate mandated sex ed, and we're considered like some of the best in the country. So that's really scary.
So glad to have y'all here. The bar is very low. The supplements that you're going to bring into this space, I'm really excited to uplift them. And it's really interesting to hear the ways that you, outside of your curriculum and outside of school, found your own ways to teach yourself, you know, having those community resources, partnerships, finding sex, etc., through your churches, your families, and from yourselves. Thank you for sharing. And so with your, you know, brains and minds, what would you like to see, what identities would you like to see addressed in inclusive sex education, and why?
So, like I said before, my sex education, we didn't learn a lot about sexual orientations. We just learned about the 4 ones in the beginning of the acronym. So something I would really want to see is kids and learning more about these orientations, because it feels a lot different learning it in school, and it's knowledge that is being learned so kids can start to figure out who they are. And another very important topic that is really touched upon is the 5 circles of sexuality, which is something I learned in my trainings for sex, etc. I learned that sexual orientation is just one circle of sexuality, and sexuality is a whole big thing. So the 5 circles are intimacy, sexual orientation, sensuality, sexual health and reproduction, and sexualization. And they all have different categories in them that all pertain to the big circle of sexuality. I thought it was super important important for me to personally, because I always connected sexual orientation and sexuality, and learning that they were separate entities that were together, but they weren't like the same thing, was very important for me. And I think it's really important that a lot of people learn about that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, just adding on to that, I think that there have been some questions about getting started in changing sex ed curriculums. I got started quite literally by sitting all of the phys ed teachers down and talking at them. That's one approach you can take. You could also go to a school board. I know it can be very difficult for youth to advocate for change in curriculum, especially when there are adults kind of holding power over you. But I would say the best advice I've ever received and ever given is to go as a group. Schools are really afraid of students exercising their voices. So if you were to go as a GSA or as a group of queer youth into a meeting, I think it says a lot about how important the topic is for students of that school. In regards to identities I'd want to see addressed, there are so many. Non-monogamy is really important to discuss. I really hate that we have to put the word ethical in front of non-monogamy, but we do. So distinguishing between ethical and non-ethical non-monogamy, talking about sexual assault beyond the topic of inherently violent rape, giving examples of things that are for sure going down in that school where that sex education is being taught, talking about sex in terms of pleasure. Really important thing for me would be to talk about kink, and I know that can be a difficult subject for people to address, but I believe in harm reduction, and I think discussion of things like choking is really important in quite literally saving lives, and making people aware of how dangerous some activities can be. I know I was also really angry once I got out of sex ed and realized that nobody discussed body safe materials or sex toys, or what porous materials were, or how different kinds of lube can have really dangerous chemicals in them. That should be taught. Youth deserve to know about that. Youth deserve to know if things are not safe to be in contact with their bodies. That's just basic. Teaching kids that it's normal to have an STI, how to seek treatment, not just what treatment is, normalize people sharing their status, normalizing negotiating with potential partners, establishing safe signals, soft limits, hard limits, normalizing asking consent frequently during activity or sex, not just once, which is just, I think, a really bad expectation that's set by a lot of the education we receive. And I think most importantly, absolutely all the ways that you can say no, giving actual scripts and language for, thank you. I just, there's so much that I wasn't taught that I'm really angry about, because I very much believe that this lack of information is putting youth in danger. And that makes me really, really mad.
It should, yeah, thank you.
To kind of piggyback, I'll like kind of touch upon consent also, because I also feel like consent is lacking when it comes to sex ed. And that could just purely be because of whatever American culture that we have harbored, that consent is not important to others, whether that be in a platonic, romantic, and or sexual space. But other kind of sexual identities that I would love to be addressed is just focusing that gender and fluid are both very fluid, and that previously, through my own experience, gender and sexuality were very, very binary, very, very like strict. Like this is like they gave us examples of David Bowie. It's like, is this a man or a woman? That kind of thing. But it needs to be a lot more broad in how we have these conversations, and then better yet, just having these conversations around these identities.
So our current sex ed system, as I've kind of said before, is designed through this have sex to have babies, and it will only look like one or two ways. So basically everything that falls out of those categories needs to be addressed, which is a lot. That includes queer identities, that includes people with physical or intellectual disabilities for whom sex might look different, and sexuality. Something else that I think it was Elle mentioned before that I just really wanted to bring up was that you mentioned discussion of kink, and something that like really blew my mind is there's this concept of like a safe word, but it's usually only like talked about like in kink communities. But I don't even remember where I heard, but like someone said like no matter, even if you're just going on like a single date, if you think it might get physical, like even if you're not talking about sex, even if you just might like make out a little or something, having a safe word is really, really helpful, because sometimes when you're in the moment, it can be hard to kind of, you know, figure out what words to say. So just something I really wanted to bring up is that like safe words in any context ever is really interesting and really helpful. But yeah, so anything that falls out of that heteronormative, patriarchal, sex for babies and nothing else umbrella.
It sounds like expanding like the definitions or the concepts or the uses of some of the terms for communication.
Yeah, so I'm Black, queer, non-binary, trans, kinky, non-monogamous, and I had 0 of those identities addressed in the sex ed that I received at school. And so I would like all of them to be addressed. So when we talk about relationships and healthy relationships, it's important to talk about relationships outside of heterosexuality, dating for marriage, to have kids. And I think it's also, you know, important to have conversations about non-monogamy and about communication and how to ensure safety when it comes to potential STI transmission if you have multiple partners, or if your partners have multiple partners, to how to navigate that. Everything else said as well in terms of safety within kink communities. In addition to just physical safety, sort of just talking about when you are trying to find a community of people who share identities with you, how to be safe in those spaces. So if you're underage, you know, don't go into like sexualized spaces or kink spaces that are for people who are 18 plus. Just being sure that everyone has the tools and information they need to access important information about their lives and about their health without putting themselves in specific like unsafe situations. And then additionally, I think inclusive sex ed definitely needs to address like masturbation and other forms of sexual activity that aren't just based in intercourse or fluid exchange. And I think that there's definitely a lack of a trans or gender fluid inclusive approach to sex ed. So ways to communicate with your partner or partners about the ways that they like to be touched, or like gender affirming approaches to sex and sexuality. That's a conversation that I would love to have. Definitely more conversations about consent, not only around activity, but around, you know, talking about traumatic topics or sexualized topics or anything else. I just think we need to do a much better job of approaching communication and consent and everything else.
Thank you. And yeah, when I hear you talk about all the different things that are missing, it really highlights the limitations of what we have now and gives all of these possibilities for what we could mean when we're saying like comprehensive or even LGBTQ plus inclusive. I'm also really glad that consent came up so much in this conversation. And so I know we've touched on this, but I am a firm believer you can never talk about consent enough. And so I would love to hear if you either want to expand or just even share again some things that LGBTQ inclusive consent-based education would sound like to you.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to for a second. So LGBT inclusive sex ed, or LGBT inclusive, my computer is not working, sorry, consent is one that definitely considers all identities every step of the way. So it's not just a popular thing that I've heard among other students or people that I've interviewed is that, you know, queer relationships will be a single chapter in a book or a single day. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be every conversation about consent includes couples and situations that are varying and different and represent, you know, the actuality of the situation. It means actually bringing in experts. I feel strongly against the fact that sex educators in public schools are for the most part health teachers, because they, at least in my home state, they're only required to do, you know, a small amount of hours of training. They're really not experts in the topic. And when this is such an important biological, sociological, psychological, I guess, time and factor of people's lives, like, it's like you don't get a history teacher to teach math and complex algebra. It's just not their specialty. So I do think we need to bring in people who really are, who have the tools that they need and the background they need to make sure that this is inclusive, but also respectful. Because as I said, you know, there are places where even if they do include discussions on LGBT topics, it's mandated that they, at the end, they have a disclaimer saying that, well, being queer is generally not accepted. And actually, it's like, they're called no promo homo laws, and it mandates that they speak poorly about queer identity. So obviously, it's not just representation. It's also positive and informed representation.
I think conversations about consent definitely need to have a discussion of consent in non-sexual contexts as well as in the context of having sex. So for instance, you know, when you talk about topics that could potentially be triggering or traumatizing to people, it's important to give content warnings and ensure that everyone who is around you consents to having that discussion, especially given the potential emotional toll it could take. You know, just consent also around general touch, whether that be like someone, you know, your friend coming up to you in the hallway and giving you a hug, ways to ensure that no one's physical boundaries are violated, talking about consent in those instances. And then additionally, just talking about bodily autonomy in all contexts, not just interpersonally. So for instance, like there's definitely not enough of a conversation about intersex people and the ways in which there are way too often unconsented to surgeries performed on intersex babies to make them fit into a gender binary. These surgeries are medically unnecessary. You know, they're given to children as young as, you know, newborns, and it can have developmental issues, physical, negative physical consequences and things. And so that's definitely a conversation that needs to be had. But we just need a more robust and comprehensive way to address consent, and it doesn't all have to be about sex, though conversations about consent in, you know, in the bedroom or in a sexual context are definitely important as well. So having safe words, talking about limits, negotiating with partners, all of that is super important.
I completely agree with what you said. It's important for consent to be taught about past just the sexual aspect, because there's so much more to consent, even like they said, like just giving somebody a hug, that it's all still important. And I think it's also really important that the topics of gender identity versus I think it's important that we learn about gender identity versus gender expression, because it's also two different things. And it's just, so many aspects are very important. And it's just important that teachers and sexual health educators are actually knowledgeable about what they are trying to teach, and that they teach it in a way that's shame people, and that people are actually learning the information and gaining the knowledge that could potentially them and other people in the future.
Yeah, adding on to that, a lot of the work I've been doing recently has been in regards to the exchanging of nude or sexually charged images or media. There needs to be discussion surrounding that. There are various laws, but again, I believe in harm reduction, and we need to be having conversations about consent regarding those topics. Workshops on negotiation. I think that there really needs to be more in-depth conversations about communication. The other day I had a really great discussion in a group for queer and trans people of color that I host weekly about verbal and nonverbal communication and what that looks like and what's considered okay for some folks and isn't considered okay for other folks. I know for me, if I'm asking for consent to do anything, I want a verbal yes. I don't take a nod, I don't take a noise or an anything like that. And that's important to me. And that's the expectation I set for myself and people in my life. So being able to distinguish that by individual is really important, giving folks the language to do that. In terms of, I think, talking about other things in regards to consent, I think consent should always be directly tied to making informed decisions. And I really think that there's such an underrepresentation of discussions of PrEP and especially PEP in sex education. And I think that it is extremely important for kids to be able to make those informed decisions, to have an understanding of all the resources they have at their disposal.
For me, I think inclusive education around consent really heavily focuses around consent of language and consent of what how we describe like sex or anything like that for trans people, because it can be very dysphoria inducing to consider certain genitalia a certain way or using some kind of language that they may not be comfortable with. And then like directing that kind of conversation as well during your sex ed and like bringing that up rather than having it be also binary and just like this is how it's supposed to be called and named, etc. And then also I touched on it last time, but focusing on consent and practicing consent outside of sexual activity, practicing consent through day-to-day with just natural things, and taking that like building that up to eventually use for sexual activity.
Thank you so much. Yes to everything you said, and like the idea of like allowing people to kind of speak for themselves also, and the ways that you wove consent into like sexual and non-sexual ideas. I really appreciate that. And then let's talk about your advocacy in terms of, we heard a little bit more, but if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the things you've done to advocate for this inclusive sex ed that you are dreaming of.
Yeah, so my, I guess, approach to LGBT inclusion and sex ed was sophomore year. I did a research project about the importance of inclusive sexual health education and the negative impacts of abstinence-only education. And so that kind of started my advocacy in that field. I'd been aware that it was a problem, but I hadn't been doing anything about it. And so I did a lot of research into specifically Texas's laws surrounding, just sex ed and everything. We do have no promo homo laws here, which means that in our sexual health education courses, there's no promotion of homosexuality. So any mention of homosexuality has to be neutral or negative. So often that looks like having conversations about STIs and HIV transmission and only mentioning homosexuality in that context, which is really terrible and awful. I wanted to change that. So junior year, I started a nonprofit called the Central Texas GSA Coalition, and we kind of banded together and worked to advocate for inclusive sexual health education in the Austin Independent School District, which is right next to mine. They'd been undergoing that fight for almost a decade, and it kept getting, blocked and then redone and blocked and redone again, and it was a whole process. But in October of 2019, the school board finally voted on comprehensive sexuality education. And so I got people together and organized a press conference. And so I spoke about my experience with sex ed. We had other students speak about their experience. And so that was really great. And then we had a group of people go in and we all gave testimony at the school board meeting in front of the board. And so that has been, I guess, my biggest advocacy that I've done for sex ed. That was really eye-opening, just to see like how difficult it has been to get that. And then now I am advocating the Texas State Board of Education is voting to, or working on revising health education standards. So I've also been involved in that.
Thank you.
Me personally, before I was out, when I was in 8th grade, we were learning, like I said, when we were learning about sex ed, but they didn't really touch on LGBT topics like at all, really. So, and I didn't really do anything about it. But as I like grew as a person, towards the end of my sophomore year, that's when I started getting more involved in LGBT plus related things, and I found etc. And through that, I've written a lot of LGBTQ plus positive topics and discussions that just try to include topics in sexual education. And it was really important to me because I wasn't able to get education when I was learning. So it was important to me to help other people who have access to this magazine and publication. It was really important for me to help them get this education while also learning more myself as I was researching and writing about these topics. And I also am part of a club in my school called Speak Club, which advocates for victims of domestic abuse and violence. And I try to make it a point that not all topics surrounding that are heteronormative, so I try to include LGBTQ plus people and things as well, so that other people can see that they are included and like we are important as well. And just it goes even as small as having the difficult conversations with friends and family about this stuff. Like it's minimal things, but it does go a long way and it makes sense.
I've done a lot of work on such sex education in general. It started with the curriculum I implemented probably 3 years back now in my high school. And obviously there's a difference between curriculum and execution, and there's some execution that needs to be adjusted. But that has been implemented for a few years. My current position right now where I'm working, oh, great, there's my dog. The current position I have now, I'm working part-time at an organization called Framingham Glass. We work specifically with queer and trans youth of color in collaboration with Program Rise, which is in our area through JRI Health. We offer a variety of free services, including behavioral therapy, medical referrals, emergency grants, rapid STI testing, non-rapid HIV testing, PrEP, PEP, Narcan and overdose prevention, sterile needles and syringe services. And then by mail, we've been doing safer sex supplies and safer use kits. It's really been a dream job for me. It's what I want to be doing. I'm going into social work in the fall in college. So, but it's been really great. And hopefully once I get back into the office, I'm able to run some workshops and help more folks access our services.
Most of my advocacy was mostly in high school, through GSA, being a GSA president through junior to senior year, I believe. We conducted mostly surveys to kind of address how my school felt about their current sex ed curriculum, what was lacking, how they felt represented, and if they did, what did they feel like needed to be addressed, and how to kind of articulate, is there a bias between the teachers, or is there something not clicking between students and teachers? We ended up having an amazing survey, actually, and ended up going directly to San Diego's district and kind of having a one-on-one with them. Like, this is just one school, but, if the data was, extrapolated, like, would we see the same kind of thing? Giving them our direct feedback, and like, this is what needs to change. This is what language needs to change. This is what kind of teaching you need to change in your curriculum when you're actually giving these biology teachers or whoever science teachers, when they're actually teaching them. And we actually had the opportunity to give a small little presentation in front of the teachers during their annual, or I believe annual teaching session, which was very, I wish it could have been better, but I wish we could have a longer time and like gotten into depth. But at the same time, I'm fairly proud of San Diego District's opportunity to let us give them like a bit of a lesson. So.
Thank you.
So I was president of my high school's Gay Straight Alliance, and I am slash like was in the like the leadership board of my college's like sex ed advocacy club, and I did a lot of things, especially in high school, that I was really proud of. But it was, my high school was kind of a conservative Trump bubble in an otherwise blue state. And I knew that the school board and the teachers would be reticent to really make changes. So I just went like for full direct action. I just started providing it in what ways that I could. And, you know, reaching out to other gay straight alliances and having workshops and using like basically recreating the trainings that we had at Sex Etc., or screening a documentary that, you know, I had done research on and knew was a reliable source of information. So I literally just, you know, I made this LGBTQ plus inclusion and sex education a reality in my town. But I also feel like, you know, my journalism as a reporter, that's one of my, I consider it a form of activism in a sense. Because I don't just write with Sex Etc. I've written with other outlets, including Teen Vogue, but this about other things as well. And my philosophy in doing that is be the person who you needed when you were younger. And so a lot of the stories that I tell and continue to tell are ones where if I think about if I had read this when I was a kid, how differently things might have turned out. Things about how, you know, for example, again, like the different forms that intimate partner violence takes, because it's so heteronormative and so like oddly specific. You know, when I was younger, I read a lot of like queer theory and feminist theory, and I thought I like was super smart, and I like, it didn't matter because I didn't even know what I didn't know, and it didn't help me. And so like after my own experiences with domestic violence occurred, or intimate partner violence with someone within a queer relationship, kind of got out, and I was kind of disillusioned because I was blindsided, quite frankly, because I was like, oh my God, how did this happen? I thought I'd read all the books and done everything right. And it's just that I didn't recognize it because I had never seen what intimate partner violence looks like within a queer relationship. So it's kind of I guess you could say my biggest, like, the biggest thing that I do for LGBTQ inclusive sex education is, in a way, representation. Representation can be good, and it shows you how positive and happy queer people can be. It can show you just every aspect of queer life and of sexuality and gender. And it's just so important that people know the diversity of experiences so they can have the lexicon to contextualize those experiences and take action, meaningful action, and take back control of their life because of it.
Thank you for sharing. And I think that is a common thing that we've heard. And the goal really is for sexual health education for folks to be able to participate in these conversations, to learn how to have healthy relationships, to keep themselves safe. And they're not able to, you know, participate and to see the things that they're learning and apply them to themselves. Really not getting that information. I know that as a queer person myself, and just like hearing y'all talk about like your younger selves is so wonderful. To hear about the work you're doing, just it's incredible. Thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for the work that you will surely continue to do. I'm glad to just bring some of that into to light. And then my last question before we turn it over to the Q&A is time to kind of talk to the folks that, you know, you're doing so much of this work, but also you shouldn't have to do all of this work. You're also like, and while you were in high school, you know, you also should be able to have as advocates with you, the educators in your schools. And so the folks that are on this call and the folks that will be seeing this in the future that want to take this on with you, what do you want them to know? What actions can they do to better support you?
I just wish that the people in charge of teaching these things know that it wouldn't hurt for them to actually know the information that they teach the students. And I honestly also wish people making the curriculum behind the whole in a state, I think. I think it's important that they also know that we, like as children, it'll help us if there are people who are actually knowledgeable about the topics that they're trying to teach us. Like Sarah said, like you're not gonna get a history teacher to teach biology, stuff like that. Like it's important that actual experts in these topics are teaching the topics. And I also just think it's really important that all topics are discussed because kids need to understand different things and be able to like explore themselves like when they're younger and everything. I think it's really important.
Yeah, adding on to that, there's so much I have to say to sex and health educators, but I think the number one point I would make is just that shame is not an effective behavior modification tool. It's not. We know this through statistics. We know this through personal experiences. We understand that to be true. And that harm reduction is not only effective but attainable and is able to meet people at their points of need. Sex education needs to be taught in a way that centers consent, informed decisions, and pleasure. And I mean, I think that's really it. It's just about not centering a specific experience and ensuring that we're giving people concrete information, not scare tactics.
I would say always playing with your gender and sexuality is so important, and allowing students to have that kind of space, whether it be in sex ed or throughout just a regular class, is absolutely essential. And nor should it be questioned or stripped from students, because that is a big issue. While others' bias are there, it's good to hold other teachers and people accountable if you see or hear about it, because the support is needed, especially through sex ed. And also, while it is awkward, and it can be awkward when talking about kink or just sex ed in general with students, it is literally imperative that you have these conversations and give them proper education, because it can quite literally set up their entire life from here on out in a sexual manner, and again can affect everything from that moment.
I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I think my views on the matter can be summarized by kids want to know this stuff, and they can absolutely handle this stuff if given the proper resources and knowledge and information. I don't think it's wise to back away from a topic. If someone's asking about it, it means they're thinking about it, it means they might be engaging in it, no matter what it might be. And as Elle called it before, it is a form of harm reduction. And I think being inclusive, there's a lot of, confusion about, how do I, apply this to queer people? Like, the resources exist. We live in the digital age where organizations like that show what inclusive sex ed can look like. So just using that and making sure that if you're talking about a certain broad topic, whether it be gender roles or consent or STDs, just asking yourself when you're reading through that material you're giving students, oh, is this exclusively focused on one experience, or do any of these examples or any of these statistics apply to other students too? If there is a assigned male at birth lesbian in the class, would this apply to that person? If there is a non-monogamous person in the class, would it apply to that person? There's so many different identities, so just trying to think through them and think from the perspective of a student, like, is everyone actually gaining something from this conversation or from this presentation, or is it really just catered to one life experience?
Just to add on to what everyone has said so far, I think it's really important to me that educators recognize that the entire spectrum of sexual expression and sexual desire and romance and relationships, all of that is valid, no matter, you know, whether you choose to have sex or not, or how you choose to do that. Everything is okay as long as it's consensual. And so I think it's really important that educators recognize that and ensure that they're providing students with tools to navigate all of those diverse ways of living and existing in this world, you know, whether that be being in a, you know, living in a polycule, or being in a monogamous relationship where your goal is to get married and have children. That's valid. Or choosing, you know, not to be in a romantic or sexual relationship. Ace and aromantic people are totally valid. And so I think it's just important for sex and health educators to recognize and affirm and ensure that people are equipped to handle that diversity and move through life with diverse perspectives. And so I think these people can better support our communities by taking an intersectional perspective, by being critical of the curriculum they're given and ensuring that it is truly inclusive and that it's helpful and medically accurate and comprehensive, and that it's not shaming anyone, and that it is harm reductive and consent focused and all of that. I think just being able to make sure that you are meeting the needs of as many people as possible is the most important thing.
Thank you. We're going to turn it over. We have a little bit of time to answer some of the questions that came up in the chat. I always wish we had more time. But I'm going to combine some things that came up here. Excuse me. So one thing I had said in the beginning was looking at the difference between sexual attraction and romantic attraction. And because this came up, I just want to highlight that doesn't mean taking that and like connecting it to sexual orientation. So saying like, so what it really is just looking at understanding that there is a spectrum within sexual orientation and romantic attraction and sexual attraction. But I'm wondering if this panel could speak to that. And also maybe speak to, there's a question of like any advice for making sure the needs of ACEs are better understood and included in the way that we talk about sexual decision-making and identities. So I want to bring that up
I think it's important to have conversations about, you know, ideally in an inclusive sexual health education world, we would be talking about the wide spectrum of identities that people can hold. And I think it would be important to talk about ace and aromantic identities in the context not of abstinence, because I think in a few of the conversations around inclusive sex ed I've been a part of, you know, there's been mention of ace people, but it's just been like ace people are abstaining, and I don't think that is an accurate framing. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm not a member of the asexual community, so if there's someone better equipped to speak on this than me, then please stop me. But I think that just talking about the fact that a lack of sexual desire or romantic desire is totally valid, that is a valid way to live life, like, yes, that's totally fine, and that sex and sexual attraction and romantic attraction don't have to be integral parts of life. You know, you don't have to frame finding a monogamous romantic partner who you're going to marry and have kids with as the goal for everyone's life. You just, you know, do whatever makes you happy. I think that needs to be the core of sex ed and of general education. Everyone needs tools and information so they can make informed decisions that are best for their lives and that allow them to be happy and satisfied.
Something I'd definitely like to add to that, you know, one of the reasons that I like the word queer is because it's kind of vague, and it just says, you know, there's this system about how, you know, gender and sexual orientation works, and I call BS. And so I really love and appreciate that, because linking back to what I said before about how there isn't just like one way of viewing the world, or how things that are considered normal aren't really normal, they're more imposed is that these are psychological human phenomenons that we are trying to describe, but the way that nature works isn't necessarily always or even usually something that fits nicely and neatly and 100% into these neat little rigid categories. We're just doing our best to classify these phenomena that kind of transcend some people's ideas about like what it means to even be human. Like some people literally cannot even imagine what it's like to not have a gender. And there are other people who are just like, I can't imagine what it's like to feel like the gender assigned at birth. So in reference to how to combine both types of attraction into the conversations that you have with your sex ed class, just remember that these labels, they do have meaning, but they're not absolute. And there isn't necessarily always, it doesn't always look the same, and you can't, you can't generalize, and you can't expect them to fit into neat categories. And I think an acknowledgement of how messy and how blurred these lines can be and are is super important, and just letting kids know if you're confused, it's not you that's broken, it's the system, it's the way that we've framed it.
Thank you. I'll just highlight that AVEN, AVEN, the Asexual Visibility Education Network, has some resources, including a sex ed, ace-inclusive sex ed guide on asexuality, and that there is an asexuality awareness week every fall and an aromantic awareness week around Valentine's Day every February, and there's more information that you can find for that there. And then really quickly, I see this and I'd love to just end on, if someone wants to share this person says, I'd love to hear what the panelists' visions are. What does a world look like when we have LGBTQIA+ inclusive sex ed with an anti-racist framing?
I personally just would like to see, as most of us would, just everybody being included. And I think something that also really needs to be discussed is that within, this is something I've heard, I can't personally really speak on this, but sometimes within like an underprivileged school district or something, and the sex education, it usually doesn't teach LGBT topics because the intersectionality is still a problem. And it's just, intersectionality is such a huge thing, and everybody should be aware of that. And I would just personally would like to see everybody just learning more topics, and I just want it to become more normalized so that people aren't shamed for being who they are.
Thank you.
I feel like for me, if we were to fully implement it and we were to teach our students this, so many more conversations would be so much more natural and comfortable. Like we wouldn't have this weird conversation around sex and just sexuality, and like it'd be easier to encompass or kind of address those who might feel like their sexuality isn't straight, or their gender might not be cis. And we'd have a lot more people be a lot more open with themselves as well, and like conversations with their family. We wouldn't have these awkward silences. And I just feel like in general, there'd just be so much change. There's so much change that needs to be had that we haven't had in the past 100 years.
I have some ideas on this, but as I think one of the, if not the only non-person of color on the panel, I just want to make sure, like, did anyone else want to say something before me? Because I really don't want to take up this time from an actual, okay. So as I just said, that I can't really speak from a perspective of a person of color, but I can speak from the perspective of someone with white privilege, that you can leverage your white privilege for these goals, such as, anti-racist sex education, and it's very important that you do so. And inclusion and an anti-racist sex education, it isn't just saying, oh, you know, that there's men, women, and non-binary people. It's saying, you know, questioning why we perceive gender the way we do, why we have certain categories for sexual orientation, why certain gender roles exist, and really getting to the root of it. As I said at the beginning, racism tints every single thing that we do, and there are tight ties between racism and homophobia, racism and transphobia, racism and classism, racism and elitism. So it's so important that like anti-racist sex ed also addresses all of those other marginalized identities and recognizes the way in which this narrative has dominated these conversations, even though that narrative is, once again, it's tinted by a white lens. It's not necessarily the truth. It's not the objective fact. It's not the normal. It's just what certain people with a certain perspective and a certain position of power are kind of imposing on a lot of the rest of the population.
Thank you so much. What a great way to end, and with an idea for the future in a world that does not have that. I did want to just highlight a couple of resources that GLSEN has. I do not have time to talk through, but they will be available on these slides and there, and you can go to glsen.org/trans to see some of them. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you for all that you're doing. I'm really excited to be living in the world that you're creating and to be alive at the same time as y'all and to see the incredible things that you will do. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to SIECUS for hosting and organizing LGBTQ Inclusive Sex Ed Week. This is my information for folks that want to follow up, and that's it for us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Becca, so much. For folks who are joining us the rest of this week, feel free to check out SIECUS.com or register for the rest of the week's webinar series. Tomorrow we'll focus on research and LGBTQ plus mental health and GSAs. So a lot of really great research. Thank you again to our panelists, our moderators, everyone. Shout them out on the chat one last time. We really appreciate all that you've done. Thank you. Everyone have a great day.